Welcome back. So today we are going to take a look at something special. This is the CrinEar Project Meta, and I'm not going to, do like the 10th unboxing and fondling of this set, but here it is, up close and personal. It is very attractive looking. I mean, definitely the beveled sides with the copper color is actually super nice. This one is sort of unmarked because it is a review sample, but yours will be serial numbered. Nice vent, nice bevel. And I think what was sort of the most important bit of this was, it's really hard to figure out the size of this in comparison to maybe something like Dusk. Like the shapes aren't, that much different. This one actually looks a little bit broader on top, and this one's kind of not quite. But when you look at them side by side, they're not quite. This one is actually a smaller, easier to fit style. This one was kind of a little bit bigger. So, yeah, not quite the same. I know at CanGen, people were saying, well, it's probably the same configuration or similar configuration, but the shell itself is definitely not quite the same, not as large as Dusk, which is something to be handy for those of you who are interested in pre-ordering and may have tried Dusk in the past. But yeah, that is what it looks like. The cable itself is super nice, a modular. That's probably a high purity copper 4-core modular. Very, very nice. So all of this is good, and as I said, I'm not going to kind of rummage through the box again. You've probably seen a few of those already. And you can certainly ask me questions that I cannot answer. I can't say what the price is, when and where. It's going to be exclusively at hangout.audio. When, how they're going to do that, don't know. Keep hitting F5 and refresh, and eventually it'll pop up. What is the driver configuration? No idea. And is it better than other sets? We'll figure that out later. But for the most part, I wanted to kind of spend some time and talk about maybe some words that popped in my head with Project Meta. Maybe these are words that popped in my head on other sets, some things that I didn't like about other sets that may be better here, or maybe these are just kind of random vague words that I decided to put on the measurement from Hangout Audio. But generally, I think at this point I've tried it, a couple meta sets, and there were some characteristics of those previous sets that I was definitely looking for to be addressed and maybe handled a little bit differently in meta. And, starting with the sub bass. I've complained about sub bass plenty of times. It really needs to be tighter. There's too many sets that really had a loose sub bass, and when you do that, when you have the sub bass that kind of arcs right through 70 or 10 dB, however you want to measure it, that tends to be a little bit too much sub bass, and you end up compensating somewhere over here, right? More sub bass, so you end up boosting out here somewhere. This becomes less transparent. It affects the whole frequency range if you don't get that right, and it doesn't sound as tight as it should be. And that also affects the mid bass, right? How do you get a really clearly delineated sub bass from mid bass? Typically we've had this sub bass and then a U-shaped mid bass, and that's fine. That's one way to delineate the two. But as you saw with Harman Target, and sort of what this meta tuning is actually trying to address is a fuller style lower mid. More natural sounding male vocals that have a body. And in order to do that, you have to kick this up a little bit. But if this is not as tight and you have a level that's a little bit too high for that specific driver that you're using, this ends up being slightly too thick, slightly soft. You get this impact that doesn't really sound like an impact. It just kind of sounds like a poof. So make this tighter. This will give you a sharper impact, better lower male vocals, fuller, more body. This is a more natural, while maintaining a sub bass and a mid bass, and these two should actually work together quite well if done correctly, and that leads you right into the transparency of the mid. So some of these other meta sets I think have gotten timbre right. Maybe they sounded more natural. I think that's kind of fair to say. Did any of them sound like they were transparent or you were in the room with that artist? No, not really. They were kind of lacking the dynamics, all of these bits out here, and I think that was generally true for most of the meta sets that I tried. I think a lot of them got labeled as natural and maybe safe, but none of them really had the dynamic and the engagement, and never really sounded as spacious as they should. So that was sort of a big thing that I'm going to be looking for in meta is how you handle some of the complaints or the feedback from those previous sets, how this gets handled and how you really move from, it sounds quite natural to now it sounds like I'm next to that guy playing, very transparent, very open style mids. Again, all of this has to work together. You need a lower sub bass, so that sounds tighter. It's not masking anything in the mids. You need to have a little bit more body. This has to have a more sharp impact. And those two being very controlled and the proper levels will give you transparent style mids. And that's kind of sort of what this style tuning is supposed to give you. And then as you get into the upper mids and you start poking in a little bit more energy for those female vocals, I'll say that whenever I see, and not necessarily meta, but whenever you see a peak at 3K that kind of looks like that, I think deeper fit is going to be the preferred fit on this one. Again, this one sort of looks like this, and just poking at it for a couple minutes, I will say that if this sounds a little sharper, just push it in with your finger just a little bit and get a slight deeper fit. This will sound a little bit more rounded off and a little bit more rounded. It'll still give you plenty of energy, but not so much the peaker energy. So yeah, not so much a complaint here, but in general, Volume S, I think actually had a very similar peak right there, but 3K peak, deeper fit, that tends to work out really well. But as you get into the treble, and again, I think a lot of the other meta sets weren't quite as engaging as they should have been. They got labeled as natural and maybe nice timbre, but they got labeled as also too safe, too boring. So I was sort of looking for meta to really bring that engagement that was really missing on all the other sets. And again, all of this, a tighter sub bass, fuller, allow this to be heard to engage without having to boost it in a very unnatural way that was going to be fatiguing or otherwise offensive to some people. So again, set up the lower half properly, the upper half falls into place, and that's what exactly should happen here. You should get that engagement, those dynamics, that should give you a more transparent mid. All of this should, function in a very nice order of operation style, left to right way. And so I'll be looking for that. And then at the other bit that the other meta sets didn't quite get, the spaciousness, right? They didn't quite sound as big. Again, a lot of the sets that sound timbre correct or natural with the dynamics that were sort of closed in and not as open sounding as they should be weren't quite as spacious out here. And that'll be the third part, the three amigos. These sort of have to all fall into place in a natural way that actually decays and rolls off in a more natural way than doing a huge peak out here, which is what most sets did, right? Large sub bass, more than 10 dB. You had this monster 15K, 16K, this artificial bump out there just to make it sound bigger than it was because you didn't set up the bass right. So, just some random thoughts on maybe things that popped in my head as I was listening to it. Maybe some general things that I will look forward to, but I will leave that up to you. And we'll take a look at this one in more detail soon. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.